Hello there, FFTCG community. I'm Judge Jared, and you're watching episode 25 of Rules Roundup, the series where I go over rules questions that were asked in the unofficial global Discord server. That's right, this one right here. And give you the answers to those questions, as well as dive into the rulings and the nuances behind those answers so that you can better understand the rules and the answers to those questions, and also be able to then kind of pay it forward in terms of being able to explain the rules to others in questions that come up, in your own communities, in your own spaces, and all of that. Or at least that's the hope here. Now it's been a hot minute, hasn't it? Yeah, we haven't seen each other in a little while. So if you weren't caught up on all the other videos, then you had some time to catch up, I guess. Maybe? I don't know. Or go revisit, watch things, or just have a little time away. We had a little bit of time away, I think. But I'm back. I'm back here for the big 2-5. We're at the quarter century mark here at Rules Roundup. And kind of like the mail or dishes or laundry, if you don't do something for a while, it just builds up. And that's the case with rules questions. So just like all those fun things there, they were building up while I was away, which means that I have a whopping 17 questions to cover today, which fairly certain is the most I've covered in a single video that was not a speed run of previous questions. So we got a lot to talk about. I'll dive into it in just one second. I guess briefly, I'll touch on the fact that the new set, Opus 27, Journey to Discovery, just came out. So people are still just getting those cards in their hands and starting to kind of see those cards in action, maybe come up with some rules questions they hadn't thought of before when they were just spoiled, because now they're actually seeing them getting played. We are only about 2 weeks until Worlds, crazy enough. And so we'll see if any of these cards make a splash at Worlds in a couple of weeks. And yeah, it's kind of where we're at as far as the kind of TCG world for FFTCG right now. But like I said, 17 questions to cover, so let's get into it. All right, question number 1 here about Cyan. It says, in regards to the when this enters, you may pay X trigger. If a player pays the cost of X, let's say X is 2 CP, can the opponent Amaterasu the trigger after the player has finished paying the cost of X? So it's mostly in the question here, but just to read it specifically, Cyan's auto ability says, when Cyan enters the field, you may pay X CP. When you do so, gain a crystal for each CP paid as X. The maximum you can pay for X is 5. So this is one of those classic auto ability situations with the when you do so phrasing. And this is something that if you don't have it already kind of burned into your memory and at the ready, you want to have it at the ready. If it says when you do so, that is your cue that this is an auto ability that when it resolves, it generates another auto ability. Provided that you do whatever was in the first half of it. In this case, it's paying X. So what's happening here is that the person is asking or saying, okay, a player played Cyan, he entered the field, we resolved this auto ability, they paid 2, that triggered the when you do so. So now we have that auto ability that goes onto the stack. And they're saying, can the opponent Amaterasu what happens after they've paid? And indeed, if you kind of follow the way I was describing that there, after paying X was when that second auto ability was generated. And as a result, that new auto ability goes on the stack. And just like any other auto ability, it's got to resolve before it does its thing. When it goes on the stack, nothing really happens. So they indeed can wait until you pay X or your opponent, whoever's doing this. And then they can use Amaterasu or some other effect to cancel the auto ability. Basically after you've committed to it. I've said it before, but a big reason for this wording of when you do so is that it's a balancing tool. It's a way for them to have a strong effect, but have a built-in weakness to it where you have to commit a certain amount, and that extra committing opens you up to the possibility of being blown out if you get canceled at that point. There are also effects that say if you do so, because those say if you do so and not when you do so, they do not generate another auto ability, which means that once they start resolving, you're going to go through the whole process without it going back on the stack. And so those are typically more powerful because there isn't that extra window for your opponent to interact between when the first half of it happens and the second half. So yeah, the optimal play if you're the Amaterasu player is to wait until they've paid. I mean, you can do it before, but you know, why wouldn't you want them to commit more CP essentially? I'm sure there's some niche situation where you wouldn't want that, but you have two opportunities, and most of the time it's going to be better to wait till they've paid, because it does go back on the stack, and then you can interact with it at that point. All right, here's one of those new cards here. We got Graha Tia, and the question is, would the Graha check all of Yuri's elements when you pull your top 5 cards, or is that specifically only a field ability? All right, let's talk about why this is a question. I will give you the context of all that we're talking about with Yuri is that first field ability, which just says Yuri has all the elements except dark. All right, we'll come back to that, but that's what we're talking about here. Graha Tia has the crazy, what is this, 7-line auto ability. This is all one auto ability, by the way. So bear with me here. The auto ability says when Graha Tia enters the field from your hand, reveal the top 5 cards of your deck, return them to the bottom of your deck in any order. If there were 3 or more different elements among the revealed cards, draw 2 cards. If there were 5 or more, also during this turn, the cost required to cast your next card is reduced by 4. If there were 8 or more, also remove all the characters opponent controls and all the cards in your opponent's break zone from the game. So they're asking in this question about Yuri's field ability, because Yuri's field ability says Yuri has all the elements except dark. So they're like, well, when you're flipping over cards for Graha's effect, does Yuri count as having all the elements except for dark? Which at this point in time, they theoretically could add more elements later, but that'd be surprising. At this point in time, all the elements except dark would mean that when Yuri's on the field, Yuri has 7 elements, right? There's the 6 main elements, as well as that Yuri is light. So the thing to understand here is that most abilities are not in effect unless they are in the correct zone for it, which the default for the for the most part is on the field. And this is one of those. It's a field ability, and so you would think just kind of, it's called field ability, so it would seem kind of obvious in one instance that a field ability is only in effect when it's on the field. I will point out there are exceptions to that. There are a number of field abilities that affect the cost of a card, and just by the nature of that, they have to be in effect before the card is on the field, because you have to be in effect when you're calculating the cost of the card. So those are kind of an exception. They're field abilities that are in effect when they're not on the field. And similarly, there are some field abilities, the ones that say like this card is also card name XYZ in all situations. And when it says the all situations, that means that is in effect in every zone, in every instance. Ironically, it's not in effect if they lose their abilities. So I always like to say, well, maybe it's not all situations, is it now? But assuming they have the ability, it's in all situations. So if Yuri had been worded as Yuri has all the elements except dark in all situations, then yes, when Yuri would be flipped there, Yuri would count as 7 elements. Now, they very specifically did not do that here, probably because they didn't want Yuri to be able to discard for any element in the game other than dark, and you usually don't need to get dark CP. Also, you would run into the weirdness of that you're not allowed to discard a light character, so I'm not even sure what the implications of that would be, as far as if my inclination off the top of my head without looking this up is because it's a light card, you still wouldn't be allowed to discard it, even though it has the other elements. But I don't know. That hasn't been tested. That's just me winging it right now. It would get complicated. Let's go with that. So they didn't want Yuri to be all the elements except when Yuri's on the field. Similar thing with Opus 1 Shantoto. Shantoto is only all the other elements that she gains when she's on the field. So as a result, that means that when Graha flips over Yuri as part of the top 5, Yuri counts as light, and that's it. I will point out, because I was thinking about this when going over the answer to the question, that what's interesting is you do have, the characters still have the abilities in every zone, but the abilities are not always in effect in every zone. What I mean by that is, like, there's the White Tiger Lassie Nimbus who can search for a forward that has Brave, right? So in order for that to work, that means that the forward has to actually have Brave in other zones. And it does. It's basically, it's in the text there, but the Brave isn't like active. It's not doing anything. And similarly, there are some action abilities that cards have that can be used when they're in the break zone, for example. So sometimes there are exceptions for abilities that can be in effect or be used in different zones, but it's pretty rare. And this is not one of those rare cases. So yeah, Yuri's not going to work for your plans and schemes to try to get those 8 elements to make magic happen with Graha. But I would love to see somebody pull that off somehow otherwise. Next question, another new card here. It says, hi, asking about the new card of the week, Locke. What happens when I Cucullin him on the stack of his enter the field ability? I know I still get to draw and discard, but his other autos don't trigger. What happens when I break him with a summon like Ifrit or Odin on the stack of his enter the field? Do his other autos trigger? So Locke here has 3 auto abilities, and I'll read them and then I'll kind of give you the context of this. So first one, it says when Locke enters the field, your opponent draws 1 card and then randomly discards 1 card. Second one is when your opponent discards 1 or more characters due to your summons or abilities, choose 1 character, dull it and freeze it. And when your opponent discards 1 or more summons due to your summons or abilities, draw 1 card. So the trigger event for the first one is just Locke entering the field. That's going to make your opponent draw 1 and then discard randomly. And then the trigger abilities for the other 2 have to do with your opponent discarding 1 or more of a certain type of card. There's an auto for discarding 1 or more characters, and there's an auto for discarding 1 or more summons. So there's actually 2 questions in here, which is why we have 2 little gold highlighted questions. The first one, we'll just dive into that one first. What happens when I Cucullin him on the stack of his enter the field ability, which is that first auto? So what happens there is that Cucullin, as you can see on the screen, it makes a forward lose all their abilities. And we already know that once an auto ability has triggered, it is independent of its source. Meaning that once it's triggered, especially once it's on the stack, even if we remove Locke's abilities, it's not going to do anything retroactively to an auto ability that already triggered or is already on the stack. So we know that Cucullin would not prevent the auto ability from when he entered the field and going onto the stack. However, because you're responding with that before this auto ability resolves, that means Locke will lose all of his abilities when that first one resolves. So when the random discard happens from Locke, then the other auto abilities doesn't have them anymore. So no matter what gets discarded, neither of those will trigger because he doesn't have either of those abilities at that point. So the Cucullin can prevent the secondary autos, if you want to think of them that way, from triggering, but it's not going to get rid of that first one there. It's shot off. It's too late for that. And the other question is, what happens when I break him with a summon like Ifrit or Odin on the stack of his enter the field ability? And it's the same thing, to be honest. It's removing him from the field. Again, the auto ability is independent of him. So removing him is not going to stop the one that triggered from when he entered, because it triggers literally the moment that he enters. There's no way to be faster than that. There's no way to interrupt him entering because characters don't use the stack. And so, it's not like casting Locke and then they can try to do something to him, especially the question is if you break him with a summon. So he's already entered the field if you're breaking him with a summon. So there's not even any question there. He's already entered the field. His auto's already on the stack. It's not going to matter. You're just not going to get the extra effects out of it, but they'll still cause you to have to draw 1 and discard 1. Now, I hope you like Locke, because we have a little double dose of Locke. Another question about him back to back here. And we're diving back to the beginning times. If you haven't seen this Squall before, we're going to talk about Squall. Yay! So the question here is, the wording of Squall is fairly unique, since instead of saying do X instead on most cards, it says discard 1 more card. I know it's still 1 effect, but how many instances would it be for the purposes of Opus 27 Locke if my opponent discards 1 type, then another of the same type? Example, I have Opus 27 Locke and Laguna out. I play Opus 1 Squall, and his auto ability resolves. My opponent discards Cloud, and I discard a Locke. My opponent then discards another Cloud. Would Locke trigger once or twice? Okay, we just went over what Locke does, so we'll leave that where it is. Squall. So his auto ability says when Squall enters the field, each player discards 1 card from his or her hand. If you control a card named Laguna, your opponent discards one more card from his or her hand. And so the underlying question with all of this, of course, is that we have that weird wording. It's not worded like what we're used to seeing with cards later. And to be honest, this is true of so many cards in the first, mostly 2 sets, but kind of first 3-ish sets, is there are some awkward wordings. They hadn't quite locked in. I wasn't trying to do that pun, but I love that I did. It's just in my DNA. They hadn't locked in all of the wording on things. One of my favorites is that there's the Opus 1 Sage and Lightning that says, when Sage enters the field, choose one character card in your break zone and add it to your hand. I love that they had to specify as character card, unlike a character whistle. I don't know, a character instrument. I don't know what else we're playing with here. Character card. So in this case, yeah, the phrasing on this, where it says your opponent discards one more card from his or her hand, is not something we typically see. I guess as a quick little side note, they also have, in more recent days sets, it's been a while, I guess, they moved away from saying his or her for discarding. They just said their hand. So it was a nice little change there to just simplify the pronoun on that. Make sure we cover everybody. But anyway, so yeah, ultimately, the thing about Locke's auto abilities is that they say when you discard one or more characters. And so this would be more obvious in the case of something like Arc that makes you discard 2 cards, and it just says on it, discard 2 cards. So if you discarded 2 clouds from your hand, and you go, okay, well, the trigger event here is when your opponent discards one or more characters. Well, I discarded 2 clouds, which that's one or more, so it's 1 trigger. Here, the question is that if when we're following the instructions in order as written, your opponent discards a cloud, and then after that, while resolving the same effect, your opponent discards another cloud. And so there's, okay, does that mean that since we had them discard in 2 different actions, essentially, are we going to trigger Locke twice? The answer here is no, actually. It's a great question because getting into the nuance and the wording of things like this is super important for understanding the rules. But luckily, from a rules perspective, we're going to treat it exactly the same. It's still one effect. There's multiple actions. They're both causing a discard, and typically what they would do, and I think this is the way that he phrased it, is, did he talk about instead of saying do X instead? So yeah, normally what we would have nowadays is it would be a replacement effect. It would say, like, if you control card named Laguna, discard 1 card from your hand, your opponent discards 2 cards from their hand instead, right? They would just have there be a replacement effect, a self-replacement effect on the entire thing, instead of having this little tagged on bit that only happens if you control Laguna. So they've tightened up since then, but we still have to resolve this card the way that it's written. But since it's all one effect, it's still just gonna be like, it's still treated as the same thing. In the same way as when we have modal effects, when we have ones that say select, 2 out of 4 actions or whatever, we mash those together. They are considered one effect, even though they do different things. And there might be different times where they're choosing stuff. But if you had an effect that said when ability chooses 1 or more of your characters, it still would only count as one instance because it's all lumped together, right? We're making a sandwich out of multiple actions here. And so, yeah, you're only going to get one of those. Now, if they had discarded a character and a summon, then you're going to hit each of those auto abilities because each of those things is happening. But they did specifically ask in this question what happened if you discarded 2 characters from this. So yeah, it's always interesting looking at some of these older cards and kind of before they had things more refined, and just kind of how we work through that. I guess the last thing I'll say about this as far as refining things is if you look at Mr. Squall's job here, he's not a seed candidate. No, he's a seed. In fact, he's one of the only job seed in the game. Him and I believe the legendary Squall in the same set are both seed. And so as far as things not lining up pretty well, if you are doing anything that reflects seed candidates, well, Squall doesn't count for that because he's not a seed candidate. He's seed. And that's just the way this game works. So fun little artifacts from Opus 1 Squall. But I think that covers everything there. So yeah, Locke's going to only trigger once for that, and that's the reason why. Ghido. If I use Ghido's action ability on my turn and I only have one card in deck, would this make me lose the match? Or would that rule only be if I cannot draw the full 2 cards during my next draw phase? Before I get into Ghido, actually, you know what? All we need to understand about Ghido is that Ghido has an action ability that makes you draw 2 cards. You don't have to know anything else about Ghido. You can just enjoy looking at the big turtle. But yeah, all we need to know is that he has an action ability, makes you draw 2 cards. But this could be true for any effect that makes you draw 2 cards. So what we're talking about here is rule processes. And just as a quick reminder, primer, whatever, on rule processes. Rule processes are checked frequently throughout the turn. Typically, they are checked right before a player is about to gain priority. And they are checking for various things to try to fix them. It doesn't use the stack or anything. Should I just basically fix them when something is out of place? And that includes win and loss conditions, right? So rule processes covers like if a player has taken 7 or more points of damage, or 6 or more and limited, then they lose. It covers if a player controls 2 cards with the same name that doesn't have the multiplay symbol, then they get put in the break zone. Same thing if you control 1 or more light or dark cards without an effect that lets you have those. But it also checks whether you have tried to draw a card and you didn't have it in your deck. And if that's the case, then you lose. The way that it's specifically worded, I don't have it in front of me, but basically it says if a player tried to draw from an empty deck since the last rule process check, wow, I can talk today, the last rule processes check, there we go, then that player loses. So it's specifically worded as if they tried to draw a card from an empty deck. So the question here is, oh, I only had 1 card in my deck, but I used the action ability, so I drew 1. But like, basically, they want to know if they get credit for getting half of the effect. Like, well, I tried to draw, but I did draw. I just didn't have the full draw. Is that fine? It's not fine, to be honest. It's cute. I like the question. But the fact still remains that as part of resolving Ghido, you tried to draw the second card, and that was from an empty deck. And so when rule processes gets checked right after the effect resolves, you lost. So yeah, it's again, these sorts of nuanced things are important to know because they can come up, and if they come up, you definitely want to know how they work. But yeah, it's too cute by half to think, oh well, I drew, I just didn't draw all of the cards, right? But yeah, since you did try to draw at least 1 card from an empty deck, then rule process is gonna get you. Behemoth. If you have 3 Behemoth in play and you attack, can you sacrifice all 3 to do more damage? Behemoth has this auto ability that says when Behemoth is put from the field into the break zone, choose 1 forward you control. Until the end of the turn, it gains if this forward deals damage to your opponent other than by its ability, the damage becomes 2 instead. It also has another auto ability that when a forward you control attacks, you can put Behemoth in the break zone. But what we're looking at here is the auto ability from when it's put into the break zone. Choosing a forward, make it so when it deals damage not by an ability, damage comes 2 instead. So the person asked the question wants to know if they have a forward that's attacking and they have a squad of behemoths on the field, full squad of 3. Can you just pop all 3 of them in the break zone and choose that forward and go ham, right? And I will say you can sacrifice all 3. You definitely can. It's not going to work out the way you want it to, though. Here's the reason why. So this is a replacement effect that's in here. It says if it deals damage other than by its ability, the damage becomes 2 instead. This is different than some effects that will say double the damage instead, right? Because the damage becoming 2 and the damage doubling, it might seem the same because normally we deal 1 damage when you deal damage to the opponent. So doubling normally doubles you from 1 to 2. And then this one says damage becomes 2. So you might think these are equivalent, but they're not equivalent because if you had, for example, a party with 2 forwards that both have an ability that says when they deal damage, double the damage instead, you would have 2 instances of doubling the damage instead. When there's multiple replacement effects, you do apply all of them, and the order here wouldn't matter because you'd have 2 of the same one. So if you had 2 double the damage instead, you would start off with, well, we're gonna deal 1 damage, and then we replace it, so we double it instead. Now it's become 2, and then we have another double it instead, and it was 2, so now it becomes 4. If you have multiple behemoth, let's say 2 behemoths, then when you deal the damage, because it gained this ability twice from behemoth, when you deal the damage, the first replacement effects kind of kick in, and the damage becomes 2, and then the second one kicks in, and the damage becomes 2 again. So because of that, you just made it become 2 twice. There's nothing about it becoming 2 that inherently means double it. If they wanted it to be doubled, they would have phrased it as double it. So they balanced that one intentionally, by the way. It's another case of where they definitely meant to have it be that way, because the other way would be much more dangerous as an effect. So if you sacrifice all 3, you're just going to have 3 different effects that make it go 2, 2, 2. And so it unfortunately doesn't work the way that you would want it to if you're trying to get a single forward to deal, say, 8 damage in one attack, which would be funny. I laughed, but it doesn't work that way. So I could get into the whole way that multiple replacement effects works, but it's not really relevant for this question, so I'll save that for when it is relevant. But yeah, suffice to say, multiple behemoths on the same forward doesn't do anything more than just a single behemoth on a forward does. All right, next up, Tenzen. Does Tenzen's enter the field create a field ability, or only give the samurai that are currently out the effect? Basically, if I play a samurai after I play Tenzen, would that one be able to attack twice? Tenzen here has an auto ability. It says, when he enters the field until the end of the turn, all the job samurai forwards and card name samurai forwards you control gain 3,000 power, brave, and this forward can attack twice in the same turn. So they're saying, all right, I had some samurai, I played Tenzen out from the limit break deck, and then before I went to the attack phase, I played another samurai. Does that samurai that I played after Tenzen, is it going to get Tenzen's effect because it already resolved, or what happens here? And this is a great example as far as just one of these very broad things, because we have so many effects in this game that say, when this card enters the field until the end of the turn, do XYZ, or like until the end of the turn, your XYZ do XYZ. It's very common. We see that phrasing a lot. And so we can take this and apply it not just to Tenzen, but anything else we see with that same phrasing. And the way it works is when we're talking about things you control, and it does say all the job samurai forwards and card name samurai forwards you control. We're talking about the ones that are on the field when this auto ability resolves. It's not necessarily the ones that are there when it triggers, because when it triggers, it just goes on the stack, doesn't do anything. But when it resolves, that's when this effect happens, and it affects any of the samurai that you control, but it's a single effect, not an ongoing effect. Meaning, it's a single effect. It does its thing once, and the thing that it does is give all this stuff to the samurai. It like hands out. We just had Halloween not that long ago. It hands out the candy to all the samurai, and then it's done. Any samurai that weren't there for when the candy got handed out, too late. There's only one opportunity. So, the effect itself does have it lasts to the end of the turn. So you might think, oh, it's an ongoing effect because, does that what they gain is, it does last that long. It's got a expiration that's longer than just immediate, right? But the doling out of this to all the forwards is a single effect that happens. And so if you for some reason played Tenzen and then went, oh, oops, I forgot to play this samurai from my hand first, it's too late. That samurai missed the candy, didn't get it. So just keep that in mind for pretty much all these effects. I pointed out before that I'm forgetting its name now. There's that backup. It's a standard unit. It's gonna bother me that I can't remember its name. But there's the Paravir. Yes, I got it. Okay, Paravir. That has the effect that says this turn the forwards you control cannot be broken. That's a case where it creates an ongoing effect that does last through the turn, and it covers anything that is on the field from before it resolved, when it resolved, all the way through when its effect wears off, including things that enter the field later. So the phrasing of this turn is very important, and we see it so rarely. I think they recognize just how powerful that is, and so that's why we don't see it. But it does exist. But we don't see it. So 99% of the time, it's this phrasing. So anytime you see this, just be aware it's at the moment it resolves. That's when the thing is happening. That's when whoever's getting stuff gets stuff, and if they're late, they're too late. Oh, everybody's favorite card, Lightning. Definitely my favorite card at this point. So at the end of the turn, I have 3 dull forwards on the field. Sephiroth LB, Lightning from Opus 26, and Terra, played by Lightning's ability. The opponent has no forwards. Since I'm forced to choose one of my forwards to die, can I stack the abilities so that Sephiroth tries to kill Terra, but it bounces to hand before it resolves, losing nothing? I love this question because it's complicated in a way that helps to illuminate things that most people aren't aware of or don't realize or just are, could use some reminding of. For Lightning, all we need to remember about her is that she has an auto ability that plays another forward, and then as part of that auto ability resolving, it creates a delayed auto ability that says at the end of the turn, return the forward that got played to its owner's hand. Okay, so we have an end of turn auto ability that says return the thing the Lightning played to the opponent or to the controller's hand. Owner's hand. Sephiroth has an auto ability that says at the end of each of your turns, choose one dull forward other than Sephiroth, break it. Now, as the question pointed out, this is one of those cases, people get caught up by this sometimes. There are some effects that do not specify that they have to be your opponent's forward. Sometimes that's on purpose because it's a balancing thing. And sometimes they do it this way, which is kind of also a balancing thing. Because, again, as pointed out, if your opponent doesn't control any forwards, then when this auto ability triggers, since it doesn't specify it has to choose a forward the opponent controls, if there are dull forwards that you control, you have to choose your own forward. Sephiroth will betray you. I know this is shocking. No, I know that you think with glorious hair like that, Sephiroth would never betray us. But yeah, it happens. So they're trying to figure out how to get out of this. They have Sephiroth, they have other forwards that are dull, and they're like, oh dang, I don't want to break my own forward. So we have 2 auto abilities that trigger during the end phase. We have Sephiroth that says at the end of each of your turns, and then we have the Lightning, the delayed auto ability, it says at the end of the turn. Both of those auto abilities trigger at the same point of the end phase, the first step of the end phase. And so here what we're looking at is the normal rule about what happens when multiple auto abilities are waiting to be put on the stack at the same time. Because you go to the end phase, both of these trigger, and then the turn player, which is yourself in this case, because otherwise Sephiroth wouldn't be triggering. Turn player takes any auto abilities that they have that are waiting to go on the stack, and they put them on the stack in whatever order they like. So because both of these are waiting to be put on the stack, you can order them how you want. So you can do what the person is asking here, which is that you can choose to put Sephiroth's auto ability on the stack first, so it'll resolve last, and then you put Lightning's auto ability on the stack above it. And what you do is you use Sephiroth and you choose the Terra that was played off of Lightning that is now currently dull. And then assuming nothing else happens, you go to resolve it. Lightning's auto ability returns the Terra to your hand. Then you resolve Sephiroth's auto ability, which chose the Terra. It looks for the Terra. It goes, Terra not here. And nothing happens at that point. And you have successfully dodged Sephiroth betraying you. Sephiroth just stabs the air, I guess. And so, yeah, that's how all that works out. Terra survives to be played again next turn and probably do the same thing if she can. So, yeah, that's how this all works out. And we are, about 35 minutes into this episode here. And if you were waiting, we've hit 35 minutes in. We've hit our shameless plug time. There we go. That's easier to see. Because I did a video all about lightning. I bet you didn't know that, right? This is definitely the first time you've watched any of my videos. You have no idea that I did a video about lightning down that way called Let's Talk About Lightning, where you can learn all about lightning and all of the weirdness of her abilities and how all that works and all of the inclinations, all the ramifications. That's the word I was looking for. All the ramifications of her ability and just understanding her in general. So if you want to know more about lightning, or you've forgotten about lightning and you need a refresher, may I present to you my shameless plug. And so if you've been dying to get a shameless plug time for the month plus since my last video, then there you go. We've done it. We've done it together. Good job, guys and gals and non-binary pals. Let's move on. All right. It says, hey, new to the game. I'm building a Type 0 deck. Good choice. I understand that you can't play duplicates of the same card name separately in both forward and backup. Can I have both of my ace cards in the field same as a forward and a backup? I'm going to point out a little look behind the curtain here. When people ask questions and I'm putting them in, I try not to alter what they've written. I try to make it as accurate to how it was asked. I will sometimes go in and like I'll capitalize things or clean up a little bit of minor grammar if there's a missing period or something or whatever. But I mostly try to keep it intact because if you're getting questions, you might get them written in the same way. And so sometimes part of understanding how to answer a question is understanding what the question is in the first place and being able to take what's being written or asked or said and translating that into what the question actually is. And so so I know that might have been a little bit hard to parse what the question was there, and I left it that way on purpose. Now, that said, this person is new and welcome to the game. I'm glad that you're playing. I'm glad that you're trying out cadets because I love me some cadets. And from what I gather from the question, you do understand the idea that you're not allowed to have like two forwards named ace at the same time. You're not allowed to have two backups named ace at the same time. And so the question here is whether you're allowed to have one of each. And if you've been playing longer than a few minutes in this game, you probably know the answer to this already. But if you're newer, you basically, the way that the card name rule works is that just on the field in general, you're only allowed to have one copy of a card that has the same card name but without the multiplay symbol on it. Doesn't matter if it's monster, forward, backup. We do have instances of a monster and a forward that share the same name. So it can happen that way too. But basically, if it's on the field and you control it and doesn't have multiplay symbol, you can only control one of it. I get the concept. There are other games that would allow you to have multiple versions of the same card in play. And I get that because they're forwards and backups, you might think, oh, I'm allowed to have one of each, right? There's a separation there. But the way Final Fantasy works is that we just lump everything in together. As far as characters on the field, we have to abide by that rule. I'm also going to say, even though this is like a newer question, and for most of you watching this, it's probably a basic question. You might be thinking, why am I covering this? I do want to point out that I think it's important to be welcoming to anybody who's getting into the game. It's always great when we get new players, and we're going to get new players that are TCG veterans and been playing forever and played a bunch of different card games. They're coming in and they already have all this background knowledge and they're just transferring that over, and things will be pretty easy for them. We have some new players that maybe it's their first TCG ever, or they've only played a little bit but never played something like competitively or just anything beyond like kitchen table games. And so I think it's important to be welcoming to people, regardless of their background or how new they are, and just to kind of make sure that we're covering and talking about questions that are relevant for everybody. And also, it's just as ambassadors of the game ourselves, being able to answer questions that you might think are super basic or obvious maybe to you, but answering them in a way that is clear and concise and doesn't try to belittle anybody or whatever. And so, I don't discriminate. I will answer any of these questions that pop up in the Discord. Doesn't matter if it's the most complicated thing in the world, which we'll get to one of those later, or if it's something that is, maybe kind of more basic to most people. But I'm happy to cover all of this because I want all of us to get better at understanding the rules and helping each other out. So if whoever asked this question originally, if you're watching this now, I hope that helped. All right, then, do summons count as backups when using the effect of promo Aerith? So she's got this auto ability that says when Aerith enters the field, reveal the top 3 cards of your deck, play one backup of cost 2 or less among them onto the field and return the other cards at the bottom of your deck in any order. So in short, when she enters the field, you flip over the top 3 cards. If there's a backup of cost 2 or less, you just play it directly onto the field. That's all there is there. The question here is if a summon counts as a backup. And this is another question that probably came from a newer player, but we're going to talk about it anyway, just to make sure to cover things here. Because one thing you might not know, even if you're more veteran of this game, is that the way that the comprehensive rules describe cards, that they say that every card in the game fits into one of 2 big groups, either summons or characters, right? So I know that if you've been playing a while, you probably already are just aware of like, well, we have 4 card types. We have forward, backup, monster, and summons. And that we know that the first 3 are characters and the other one summon. But summons are technically their own subgroup, like, or equally sized group to characters in the game. I don't know if they would ever give us something that counts as a summon that's not a summon. It's kind of weird because like both the name and the card type is the same. But they do describe as being 2 different groups of cards, so it's theoretically possible. And so you might not have known that they are both, that just like characters is a subgroup, so is summons. But they are distinct from each other. So backups are not summons. Summons are unique in the sense that they are the only cards in the game that get played directly to the stack. They're the only cards in the game that do not go to the field. There's lots of distinctions there, but yeah, backups are characters in the same way that forwards and monsters are, and summons are unique outside of that. So Aerith's only going to be able to hit backups, specifically backups. All right, another new player question here. It says, new player here, when Faris enters and deals 1,000 damage to each forward, if my opponent controls 2 other Warrior of Lights, does the effect to deal 3,000 damage apply for each forward for a total of 9,000 damage? Bear with me a second here in my self-described neurodiversity, because the question says Warrior of Lights, and I'm fairly certain the way we would want to describe them is Warriors of Light. It's kind of like Attorney Generals, right? Where if you actually don't say the words Attorney Generals, if there's multiple of them, it would be Attorneys General, which is the fun one there. So instead of being Warrior of Lights, we're talking about Warriors of Light. Anyway, grammar aside here, the question is about Faris, and basically how her ability works with hitting multiple Warriors of Light. So she's got the out ability that when she enters the field or attacks, deals 1,000 damage to all forwards, just everywhere. She just lights everybody up. And in this scenario, the person laid out, the Faris player has 2 other Warriors of Light, and so they're asking, does the effect to deal 3,000 damage apply for each forward for a total of 9,000? So the way to think about this is that the auto ability that she has that causes the damage there, where it says when Faris or a job Warrior of Light forward you control is dealt damage, choose up to 1 forward opponent controls and deal it 3,000 damage. So it's an auto ability, and the trigger for it, the trigger event, is when Faris or a job Warrior of Light forward you control is dealt damage. So each time that trigger happens, it's going to create an instance of this auto ability that goes on the stack. Now, because it's phrased as when Faris or a job Warrior of Light forward you control is dealt damage, and not when 1 or more is dealt damage, that means every single instance of a Warrior of Light that you control forward, you control being dealt damage, is going to trigger a separate instance of the auto ability. If it had said 1 or more, then hitting multiple would have just done 1. So because of that, you got 3 Warriors of Light, and the damage goes out simultaneously. It hits all 3 of them, and then when it hits all 3 of them, because there was 3 instances of this trigger event, you will have 3 instances of Faris's auto ability trigger and then get put on the stack. So they are separate from each other. We're not going to lump them all in together, and so you can choose different targets for each of them if you want. You can choose the same target if you want, but for reasons that are very important for various effects and rules and all that, it's 3 different auto abilities that each separately deal 3,000 damage, because 3 auto abilities dealing 3,000 each is mechanically distinct from 1 effect dealing 9,000 damage. So yeah, you can put all 3 of them on the same one, and assuming that nothing stopped those from resolving as is, you will end up with a total of 9,000 damage on the same forward, but it's not all one lump sum. So just think of it that way. Similarly, if like one of those auto abilities gets canceled, then the other two will still resolve. Like you'll still have two sets of 3,000 going out, as opposed to if they were all lumped together, then canceling it would cancel the whole 9,000. So yeah, just be aware that each instance of this is just a separate little pew of 3,000 damage. All right. I am curious if Diabolos counts as the fourth cast to make all enemy forwards power 3k. I love this Diabolos art because he just looks so delightful in his chaos. So this card, if you've never seen it before, says choose one forward. Its power becomes 3,000 until the end of the turn. And then if you have cast 4 or more cards this turn, all the forward's power becomes 3,000 until the end of the turn instead. So the question is if Diabolos counts as the fourth cast. So this question comes down to when we're checking how many casts there were. And there are some cards that will check when it's being put on the stack. There are some that will check. Actually, I think all the ones that check when they're being put on the stack will probably also check when it's resolving. But there are some that only check on resolution. How do we tell the difference between those? Well, usually the ones that check when it's being put on the stack, if it's an auto ability, it will have a condition on it that'll say like, when this is being put on the stack, or when XYZ, the trigger event. It'll say if you have cast 4 or more cards this turn, and in that case it would be checking both on when it's going on the stack and on resolution. And then for a summon, I'm not really sure off the top of my head what the wording would be if they want it to be checked on when it's being cast. But basically that gives away the answer here, which is that this is checking on resolution. And the point I want to bring up with this is just a reminder that when effects are put on the stack, there's very few things that happen when they're being put on the stack. There's, and yes, with the case of conditional auto abilities, there's they are checking when it's going on the stack, if that's the case. And so I can see where this question would come in. Summons, I can't even think of one off the top of my head that has like a precondition like that. Yeah, but anyway, point is this is going to check when it resolves, and because of that, it will count Diabolos. And the reason why is because the way that a game tracks when you cast something is after you finish paying for it, and in the case of a summon, it's gone on the stack, or in the case of a character, it's entered the field. Like after you've done those things, the card is considered cast. So a summon, even though it hasn't resolved yet, you might be thinking, oh, well, after it resolves, now I'm done casting it, right? But no, actually the cast counts as just paying for it and sending it off to do its thing. So because of that, the Diabolos itself is already been cast when it's resolving. So if you cast 3 other cards and then the 4th one is Diabolos and you cast nothing else, then when it resolves, it looks and it says, oh, you cast 4 things because you cast the 3 before Diabolos and you cast Diabolos. And so it will indeed get that if you cast 4 or more self-replacement effect there. I do have to point out, because the person who asked this question may not have realized this, it says, will it make all the enemy forwards power 3k? The answer is yes. However, just like I was mentioning with Sephiroth, where you got to watch the wording on things sometimes, let's look at the wording here one more time on Diabolos, because it says all the forwards power becomes 3,000 until the end of the turn instead. What it does not say is all the forwards opponent controls power becomes 3,000 until the end of the turn instead. So Diabolos, delighting in his chaos over here, will make all of your forwards become power 3,000 until the end of the turn as well. So just be aware of that. If you're going to embrace the chaos, embrace the chaos. But Diabolos is fun, question mark, in the sense that when you get that effect, it's going to make everybody across the board 3,000, right? Does not discriminate. Diabolos just hates everybody equally. And so, yeah, it's that effect actually makes every forward on the field power 3,000. And not just the opponent's ones. So be careful there in case you were trying certain shenanigans. I don't know. Anyway. Althyl says, does Althyl still have the cost requirement for having 412 out when it's a burst? I assume so, but I figured I'd check. So Althyl is indeed one of the 12 from Opus 26, and Althic's ability here says, when Althyl enters the field, choose one forward opponent controls. If you control 4 or more, job the 12, deal it 9,000 damage. Now, this is a case where it is only checking the number of 12 you have on resolution. It's not a conditional auto ability. If it was a conditional auto ability, that would have been part of the initial sentence. It would have said, when Althyl enters the field, comma, if you control 4 or more, job the 12, comma, choose one forward opponent controls. We don't have that here, so it's not a conditional. It doesn't really matter for X-Burst, I guess. But the question is, do you still have to have 4 of them? And the thing to always remember about X-Bursts is that the only thing we ignore with X-Bursts is the trigger event. Everything else about the card, I guess, okay, I'm going to back it up just a quick second. If there's something on the card that affects the cost of the card, we ignore that too, but that's always written separately above the X-Burst line. So everything after the X-Burst line, gotta be clear here. Everything after the X-Burst there, we are including all of that except for the trigger event. And the trigger event is always the when da-da-da-da, or if it's a summon, there is no trigger event. But like for autos, we ignore the trigger event. We do everything else. So in this case, Althyl, when you target the, when you, what's the word I'm looking for? When you use the X-Burst, you decide to activate the X-Burst. Really all we're doing is it's just saying, choose one of forward opponent controls. If you control 4 or more, job the 12, deal 9,000 damage. So all that to say, yes, you still need to have 4 or more. We are not ignoring that part. We're ignoring the when Althyl enters the field, because clearly Althyl's not entering the field from an X-Burst. But we are still bound by everything else that's going on here. All right, Black Waltz 3 says, do I need a target to repeatedly cast this ability, or does the card in hand get discarded regardless of if there's a target or not? Black Waltz 3 is a fun one. These Black Waltz cards, they have such a unique ability. We're going to ignore most of the text here on Black Waltz 3. All we're looking at is the action ability at the bottom. It costs 0 CP, and it says the effect is discard 1 job Black Mage from your hand. When you do so, choose one forward of cost 3 or less opponent controls, break it. So this is very unique for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is that we do want to just be clear that the discarding a job Black Mage from your hand is not part of the cost. It might be easy to miss because this is such a weird ability, and it's also written right towards the beginning of that anyway, and the font is tinier than normal on this card. But this card is not part of the cost, it's part of the effect, which is important for cards that do things based off of being discarded due to an effect as opposed to being discarded for a cost. So that's already one thing there. The second thing that makes this pretty unique is it has a when you do so, but this is an action ability, and it's not very often that we have something other than an auto ability that generates an auto ability. It can happen. We can have a summon generate an auto ability. We can have an action ability generate an auto ability. It's just very rare. So the normal use case for this is that you declare the action ability, and it goes on the stack, and you pay nothing to put it on the stack. And then when it resolves, at that point, you discard a job Black Mage from your hand. That triggers the auto ability, and the auto ability makes you choose a forward of cost 3 or less opponent controls, so you choose that. But then this, when you do so, goes on the stack, and then when it resolves, now you finally break the forward. Which does mean your opponent, if they want to, they could wait till you discard the Black Mage and then target whatever, and then they can Amaterasu this auto ability. So even though you started off with an action ability, it created an auto ability that can be Amaterasu'd and then blow up Black Waltz 3. So watch out there if you're the Black Waltz player. But the other thing that's so interesting about this is that because discard 1 job Black Mage from your hand, from your hand is part of the effect, and you're discarding it from your hand, you don't have to discard a card or Black Mage from your hand. This is not the most intuitive thing. You might think, well, wait, no, if I have one, I have to discard one, right? That's what the card says. I can't just ignore what the card says. The thing is, your hand is a hidden zone. Your opponent doesn't know what's in your hand, and even if they do know what's in your hand, the rules say because it's a hidden zone, they're like, we're not gonna verify. So even if they just saw your hand before this, like they just Zidaned you or something and saw your hand and then nothing has changed and you go back, and even if they know 100% there is a black mage in your hand, if you use this ability, when it resolves, you are not required to discard a job black mage. You can just be like, when it resolves, you just go, oh, I'm not discarding one. And because it's a hidden zone, you're not required to. Like, we're not going to hunt you down or make you reveal your hand to prove you don't have one or something. Even if, again, if we know you have one, you still aren't forced to because it's a hidden zone. It's a little bit weird, but that's how it works. So that ties into this question here, which is that, do I need a target to repeatedly cast this ability? And oh, well, this is, does the card in hand get discarded regardless? Well, like I just said, the card doesn't get discarded if you don't want it to be. But separate from that, the target doesn't happen until after you discard the black mage anyway. So if you did discard the black mage, then what happens that's so interesting here? So you discard it, and then it creates the auto ability. But let's say your opponent didn't have a valid target, right? So you resolve this by discarding the black mage, and that's totally legal. You can do that. Then it creates this auto ability, and when this auto ability goes to go on the stack, it goes, hey, there's no targets. And then it immediately removes itself from the stack before anybody can do anything, and then it just goes away. But your job black mage is still gone, right? So you can do that. If I'm sure there's some niche situation where maybe that's useful, question mark. But I guess if you were, okay, here's your niche situation. You have one card left in your hand. It's a black mage. Your opponent just did an effect that makes you discard, and they have Vice on the field that when you discard, they get to choose a character you control and double freeze it. So you're trying to just get rid of the card in your hand so that it doesn't get discarded. So you use the Black Waltz ability, you discard that black mage, and then it goes to trigger and goes, there's no target, and then there's no target, and then, et voila, no cards in your hand to be discarded. There's our niche situation. All right, I found it. So you can do that. And then the question is, do you need a target to repeatedly cast it? Well, okay, first off, it's not casting. I do want to point this out. Casting is specifically playing a card from your hand by paying the casting cost, except in the case of summons, where summons, when they are cast in any way, they are always cast, even if it's not from your hand or even if it's an effect. But anyway, so this is activating an action ability. But here's the thing. There's no target required to use it, and it costs nothing to use it, and you can only do this X amounts of times per turn. So you can technically do this infinite times. I say technically, because at a certain point, you're going to get a judge called on you if you're just being too cute with this, right? If you said, oh, I'm activating Black Waltz's ability, I'm holding priority, I'm going to activate it 100 times before I pass priority, and then we're going to resolve the first one, and then we're going to resolve the second one, and then we're going to resolve the third one, right? If you do that, that's slow play and stalling and all that not fun stuff, right? Don't do that. But technically you can do it multiple times. You also don't want to try to find the limit of how many times can I get away with it before I'm going to get a judge called on me. But to answer the question, yes, you can repeatedly use it. And if you, for some reason, did want to discard, okay, actually, here's the other niche situation. I don't know why I didn't think about this sooner. All three of these Black Waltzes in this cycle have that when it's discarded from your hand, choose a forward and do something to it, right? So I guess that's the situation, right? Is that you're like, well, I want to deal the 4,000 damage, but I don't have a target, so I'm just going to discard this just to deal the 4,000 damage. Okay, sure, you can do that. So that's a little bit less niche, I guess. So in that case, yes, you can do it multiple times, and that's fine, even without a target, because targeting doesn't happen until the auto ability, and that's after you've already resolved the effect of discarding. So there's our little discussion about the oddities of Black Waltz 3. All right, so say I want to cast Rubicante and I only have 2 cards in hand, no backups. Would I be able to pitch both cards for 4 CP, pay 1, and then pay 2 for the X cost? Or since I have overpaid, is there a requirement to pay all the remaining CP into the X cost, which would prevent me from searching out any 2-cost Archfiends? All right, before we get into the rule nuances here, We have Rubicante here, but we don't actually need to know anything about his abilities. All we need to know is that he costs 2. So there you go. Cost 2 Rubicante. Golbez, on the other hand, has an action ability. It says search for one job Archfiend of cost X and play it onto the field. The cost is X and then also 1 of any CP. You can only use this ability once per turn. So the cost is that combination of X, whatever you decide to pay, and then 1 of any CP. And so what they're saying is they want to play Rubicante, who costs 2. And they want to do Golbez's effect to do that. So normally what you do is you pay the X, which is the cost of Rubicante, so that's 2. And then you would pay the 1 in addition, right? So that's 3. And they're like, I only have 2 cards in my hand. I don't have any backups. My only option to pay for this is to discard 2 cards and pay 4. And they're saying, do I need, like, am I hosed, right? Because I'm paying 4, but one of those is for the 1 cost. So now does X have to be 3 because I generated 4 CP? It's a great question because it gets into the nature of paying for things and how overpaying works and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do and all that. And just the couple of things I want to point out here. First off is the reminder that all costs are paid simultaneously. So it gets lumped together. Because it gets lumped together, we have this 1 generic CP and we have the 2 that we're paying for X, which is also generic CP. It gets all lumped together. So we're going to be paying 3 all as 1 lump sum. We're not paying 1 and then the X, which is 2. We're not paying like separately. It's all lumped together. It's like getting the bill at dinner. The bill is not pay this amount for your soda, pay this amount for your burger, pay this amount for your appetizer, right? They go, here's all the things that you got, but here's your total. Pay the total. That's what's happening here, is that everything gets lumped in together. We pay it all at the same time. So that's how it works. And then the rules with overpayment is that I'm not going to dive into all of the rules of overpayment because it gets complicated when we talk about multiple elements that are required. I don't want to dive all the way down that rabbit hole, but I'll say for this, because we don't have to worry about specific elements, the rule is when you're discarding for CP, you're allowed to overpay by 1. Specifically, only when you're discarding as part of your generating the CP there. So because of that, you're allowed to overpay by 1. So if it costs 3, yes, you're allowed to generate 4 CP to do so. And the extra CP in that case is wasted. You don't get to use it for anything else. It doesn't do anything. It just goes away. So yes, you can do that, but you're not required to make the X be 3 because you're allowed to overpay by 1. What you do need to do is that when you're using this effect, you need to be specific and clarify to your opponent that X is 2. This is important because that's information for them. Like when they know whether or not they want to maybe cancel it or they want to do some sort of reaction before the ability resolves, it's a big difference whether that X is 2 or X is 3. And so it's not that you get to choose once you go in whether you're going for a 2 or a 3, because that also would make a difference. Maybe by the time it resolves, the landscape of what's on the field has changed, and you go, oh, you know what? Actually, I want to get a 3 anyway. So you have to be clear that you're overpaying, but that X is 2. As long as you do that, you're allowed to do it. You can go ahead and grab a 2 like Rubicante and play it onto the field. But just being clear about your communication and what X is, defining X, and then paying, and then saying, I'm overpaying. So yeah, you can do it. All right, here we got Shiva and Terra. The question is, I'm looking for some clarifications here. Opus 8 Shiva has the restriction of only being able to be cast during my turn, but Opus 10 Terra's action ability of casting a summon of cost 4 or less has no restrictions on usage, except the summon in question has to be from my hand. So, can I use Terra to cast Shiva in response to something on my opponent's turn? I'm asking because both the keyword cast both use the keyword cast, and I want to know if and or how that clashes or does not clash, and how the restriction of can only be cast excuse me, during your turn works in this interaction. Thank you. So Shiva here. Doesn't really matter what she does. All we have to do is look at that first sentence. It says you can only cast Shiva during your turn. That's the operative thing here. Terra, meanwhile, has this action ability that the effect of it says cast 1 summon of cost 4 or less from your hand without paying the costs. So they want to know, Shiva says you can only cast Shiva during your turn. Terra says cast something. So we basically have one card saying, you like, here's your restriction, but you can cast it, and the other one saying, oh, cast it. So they're wondering, can I use Terra to get around the restriction? Basically, like if I have something that says to do it now, does that override something saying I can't do it now? And kind of getting into what the definition of cast is here. I just mentioned it on the previous question, but for summons are always cast. The exception being if you activate an X burst off of a summon, that does not count as casting the summon. But any other situation where you're getting the effect from a summon, basically, other than activating its X bursts via an effect or damage, it is casting. It's not like characters where there's a distinct difference between casting it and playing it to the field. Summons are always cast. But there are some cards like Shiva that do have restrictions on how and when you can cast them. And people do like to get into the idea of that like can't is more than can, or can't overrides can. In this situation, it's a little more complicated than that, because Shiva doesn't say you can't cast it during your opponent's turn. It says you can only cast Shiva during your turn. So it's a nuanced thing here. I'm not trying to be pedantic, but with the rules, you kind of have to be pedantic. So it doesn't say you can't cast on your opponent's turn, but it does say you can only cast it during your turn. And the thing is, we are bound by that no matter what the vehicle is for how we're casting this. In the same way that there is a general rule in the end phase that you're not allowed to cast summons at all. But if you had an effect resolved during the end phase that says to cast something, you still can't cast it, because the rules say you can't cast it there. Even if the effect says cast something, the rules would just say, no, you're not allowed to. It's like having an effect that tries to play a card to the field it's illegal for you to control. When you go to resolve it, the effect just doesn't play it to the field because the rules say no. Now here it's a little bit different, because this is not you casting it and then saying no and then it goes away. Like, it's just you're legally not allowed to do that. Although, actually, I'm going to back up 1 second. If you did use Terra and you tried to cast Shiva, it wouldn't work. And technically, if we were being really, really strict about this, then Terra's effect would still be used. It would just be that, because like it's still legal to use that ability. It's just when it resolves, if you don't have another summon to cast other than Shiva, you're just kind of you're SOL at that point. In like more casual play and locals, they'll probably let you take it back, maybe. But anyway, it's kind of getting into the weeds a bit. So there are cards like Shiva that have these restrictions. Another similar case, although it's not a summon, is both Ward, the fire forward, and Titan, the 3CP Earth summon. They both have restrictions on what element you can use to cast them. So Ward says you can only cast Ward using Fire CP, and Titan says you can only cast Titan using Earth CP. And it has been ruled before that even if you have something like Zidane, which steals the opponent's cards, and then the effect says you can cast this card using CP of any element, even if it says that, we're still bound by the restriction on the card itself. So if you stole that ward and then wanted to cast it, you don't have 3 fire CP to cast it, you can't cast it. So Zidane or something like that, it bypasses like the normal casting rules with elements there, but it doesn't bypass the text of the card. And so here with Shiva, we can't bypass the text of the card. If it says you can't cast it during your, or you can only cast it during your turn, you can only cast it during your turn. There's no cutesy way around it. And that's probably disappointing, but yeah, there's no way around it. And casting with, in the case of summons, is pretty universal across the board as far as how it works. And so it doesn't matter if we're paying the cost or not, if we're doing it via an effect or something, it's casting is casting. You do the Incredibles meme. Casting is casting. That brings us to our last question. We've already reached the end here. Final question of the day. And you can see it's a bit of a doozy. We got 4 cards there. I don't normally plan on showing 4 cards at a time, but this is one of these questions that, even though it looks simple, only 3 lines of this question, this is a complicated question. I'm like, we need to see all 4 cards for reference here. So, says, the opponent's board state includes the characters shown, and they are at damage 3. Would Fat Chocobo do a single instance of 16k damage to Tidus before the reduction, or would it be 2 separate 8ks? All right, let me catch you up to what's going on here. So Fat Chocobo is a summon that just says deal 8,000 damage to all the forwards opponent controls. That's all you need to know about that. Just dealing 8,000 damage, just going boom, landing on the field, 8,000 damage to all the opponent's boards. Yuna, we don't need to know what she does. We just need to know that she's Yuna for the purposes of this. Tidus, on the other hand, is pretty relevant here for a couple of reasons. One is that he has a field ability that says if a card named Yuna forward that you control is dealt damage, the damage is dealt to Tidus instead. So we have a replacement effect here. It's saying when damage is dealt to Yuna, the replacement effect says no, it's dealt to Tidus instead because he's such a good boy. He's job guardian. That's what he's doing. So we already have that going on. So with nothing else, before we get into the rest of what's going on here, you can imagine the situation where Fat Chocobo gets played. We have Tidus and Yuna on the field and goes whomp, and it deals 8,000 damage to Tidus. And at the same time, it deals 8,000 damage to Yuna, but because of the replacement effect, the 8,000 damage to Yuna gets dealt to Tidus. So now we have 8,000 damage twice going to Tidus. That's how that would resolve with nothing else going on here. Tidus, however, also has another ability, a field ability. It's damage 3. Says if Tidus is dealt damage, reduce the damage by 2,000 instead. Okay. Actually, I'll swing back to that for a second because the last card here is Minwu. Good old Opus 1 Minwu. Says if a forward you control is dealt damage less than its power, the damage becomes 0 instead. So we have another replacement effect. We have 3 replacement effects for damage here, and this is why it gets complicated. So their question here is, when this damage gets rerouted to Tidus, does it get lumped in with the initial damage, or is it considered like a separate packet of damage? Here's the reason why. If it's 2 separate sets of damage, then here's how things would resolve. The way it would resolve is that we would have these 2 sets of 8,000 damage going to Tidus. The first set, we would handle that first, and then because we have 2 different replacement effects for damage, the first one, presumably the Tidus player, would reduce the damage by 2,000. So, okay, now it's down to 6,000 damage. And then we would apply Minwu's replacement effect, which says if the damage is less than the forward's power, it becomes 0 instead. So now it's 6,000. It's less than the 8,000 of Tidus's power. So now it goes down to 0. Then we would resolve the 8,000 damage from Yuna, and we would do the same thing because it's this new packet of damage. We would go, all right, reduce it by 2,000. Now it's 6,000, and then use Minwu. It's less than Tidus's total power. It's been reduced to 0. So the reason for this question is because if it's considered 2 separate packets of damage, you see how with the right management of those replacement effects, we've now gotten the damage down to 0. Tidus and Yuna both survive Fat Chocobo, which is wild. If they are not 2 separate packets of damage, here's what happens. Fat Chocobo goes 16k to Tidus. Wham! His first... Well, it doesn't really matter the order here, but let's do it anyway. The replacement effect goes, reduce it by 2,000. And he goes, okay, well, now it's just a cool 14,000 instead of 16,000 to Tidus. And then Minwu goes, is that less than your power? And Tidus is like, hell no. And then Tidus just gets flattened by Fat Chocobo. So we have 2 very different results depending on whether this is 2 separate packets of damage. So you can see where the question comes from and why all of these puzzle pieces are all relevant. And it just makes for a fun visual. So the answer here is it is actually 2 separate instances of damage. So if you were looking forward to the hilarity of Tidus and Yuna somehow surviving this 16k whomp, or at least Tidus specifically surviving it, yeah, it's pretty hilarious, and that's how it works. We've had similar rulings. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we've had similar rulings with Daisy. I'm sure that none of you probably have seen Daisy enter the field in a very long time, if ever. But Daisy is an Earth forward that says when any other forward that you take or that you control is dealt damage, deal the damage to Daisy instead. And then she also has a fun special ability that increases her power by 30,000 till the end of the turn, which is just ridiculous. And so we've had questions before when Daisy came out about when there's simultaneous damage, like something like Fat Chocobo, that goes out, and whether or not those instances of damage get lumped together when the replacement effect happens or not. So we already have that precedent, basically. And so we can apply the same thing here because it's the same situation in terms of a single effect causing damage simultaneously to multiple forwards, but one of them has a replacement effect making the damage be rerouted to them. So then how do we handle that? And it's it basically in short, um, it's how we're resolving Yuna's damage, and even though it's happening simultaneously, we're still technically like resolving the damage one at a time. Like I know that when this happens in general, when damage is dealt to everything, we kind of just scoop up the cards and put them out. But like, um, in the nuanced kind of getting into how the game works here, we're not technically dealing all the damage simultaneously in that way. Or even if you think of it that way, it's two separate instances. We're not just gonna, because there's a new instance coming in, we're not just gonna like pile that on top and mix it in with the initial 8,000 to Tidus. So yeah, it's a really interesting like just combination of effects to try to untangle there. So yeah, want to make sure we included all 4 cards on that. I know they're kind of smaller, it's a little harder to see, but to give you the full idea here, and it's just a fun question. I like that question. So, but that's the last one for today. We did it. 17 questions. We did it. We're back. Actually didn't take quite as long as I thought. Took a while. Didn't take as long as I thought though. So yeah, if you lasted this long, thank you for sticking with me here for this mega sized number 25. It's like comic books. When you get to issue 25, it's like giant double sized issue 25. So unintentionally did that, but we're here and we did it. If you're trying to get a hold of me, if you want to get a hold of me, you've got all these different ways down here. My hands are never quite in the right position. All these different ways down here to get a hold of me. On Discord, my DMs are open and my username is Judge Jared. On Facebook, you can find my page over there, which is facebook.com/Judge Jared. You can hit the old like button there. On YouTube, where you are more than likely watching this, unless I'm like embedded on Discord, I guess. But even then, it's still just YouTube embedded on Discord. But anyway, YouTube, my channel is @JudgeJared, so you can find me there. If you haven't subscribed already, subscribe, join. I'm currently, as of this recording, at like 258 subscribers. So I'm starting the long march to 300, which would be very exciting. So if you want to be one of my 300, so that we can all be Sparta together or something, then join me. But actually, my college alma mater, they were the Spartans. So hey, there you go. That works. And then lastly, on ye old Twitter, I am at Judge Jared FFTCG, so you can find me there on Twitter as well, and follow me and see when I tweet at Hobby Japan with interesting rules questions and stuff. But yeah, those are the various places that you can find me. I won't really dawdle any longer here because I've talked long enough, and I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed getting to do this again, and I'll be back before long, I guess. But yeah, so as always, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for being here. I'm Judge Jared, and until next time, court is adjourned.